Take your tools and get out, Marcus. I need a husband, not a handyman humiliating me in front of my board.
The rain in Atlanta that October was 39 degrees and coming in sideways, and I remember thinking the porch light was off again, the way it always went off when Priscilla was worried about the electric bill, even in a house we could afford twice over. My canvas tool bag came through the front door before I did tools first, then the bag itself landing hard enough on the wet boards that a socket wrench skittered off the edge and disappeared into the grass. Water ran off the brim of my cap and down the back of my collar, and somewhere down the block, a neighbor's dog barked twice at the thunder and went quiet again. I picked up the wrench first. Then I picked up the bag. Then I stood there in the rain a moment longer than I needed to, because 19 years of marriage teaches a man that the fastest way to lose whatever dignity is left in a room is to answer too quickly. She shut the door before I could say anything back. And the porch light stayed off the entire time I stood there, soaked to the skin, listening to the deadbolt turn. Behind her through the front window, I could see the dinner party still going, 6 of GreenFlow's board members in dry clothes, laughing at something none of them would ever repeat to my face. One of them raised a glass toward the window. Not unkindly more, the way a person toasts a joke they think nobody outside the room can hear. I stood there and let the rain finish what the last 19 years had already started. She had no idea that zipped inside the bottom pocket of that same canvas bag, buried under 30 years of pipe wrenches and compression fittings, was a manila folder holding the original notarized assignment for a water filtration patent that her company's flagship city contract depended on entirely. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 47 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed one simple thing, that if a man worked with his hands long enough and loved somebody quietly enough, none of it ever needed to be said out loud. I learned that belief the same place I learned everything else that mattered, kneeling beside my grandfather, Cornelius, under other people's sinks, starting at age 9, handing him wrenches before I was tall enough to see over the counter, watching him work without complaint through jobs that paid almost nothing because the family on the other end of that pipe needed it fixed more than he needed the money. Somewhere in my workshop on Cascade Road, under a bench my grandfather Cornelius built with his own 2 hands the year I turned 12. There was a small tin box I had not opened in 9 years. That night, standing in the rain, with my whole life zipped into a duffel bag, I still didn't know how soon I was going to have to open it. Cornelius used to tell me, water always finds the truth in a house. It just takes its time getting there. I didn't understand what that meant until I was 47 years old, standing in my own driveway watching the woman I'd married for 19 years lock a door I had personally paid for twice. If you have ever built something real with your own 2 hands, while somebody close to you decided that made you smaller, I want you to stay with me through this one, because it's for you. Let me take you back further than that rainy porch, because that isn't really where this story starts. 19 years earlier, I was a 28-year-old journeyman plumber with my own small service truck and a growing client list scattered across Collier Heights, and Priscilla Hargrove was a sharp, hungry 25-year-old, finishing her undergraduate degree at Spelman, with nothing behind her but a mother who cleaned downtown offices at night and a father whose hardware supply business had folded when she was 11 years old. I met her at a cookout on Cascade Road, the kind with a whole hog on the grill and 3 generations of one family arguing good-naturedly about the potato salad, and she was the only person there who asked me a real question about my work instead of a polite one. I loved her before I fully understood what loving her was going to cost me. We married 2 years later at Cascade United AME, the same church my grandmother ushered at for 40 years. Cornelius walking me down the side aisle because my own father had passed by then. Reverend Adcock said something that day about 2 people building a house together, and I remember thinking with the particular arrogance of a 28-year-old that building was the one thing I already knew how to do better than anybody in that sanctuary. Cornelius passed 6 years later, and the same congregation that celebrated our wedding filled that sanctuary again for his homegoing service, the choir singing the same hymns he'd ushered people in and out of for 4 decades. I gave the eulogy that day with my voice cracking twice, and Priscilla held my hand through the whole service. And for a long time afterward, I believe that moment proved we were exactly as solid as I needed us to be. I didn't understand yet that a house can be built, level and true, and still flood, if only one person is the one checking the foundation. The first thing to go was half my equipment. I sold 2 of my 3 service trucks and the better half of my tool inventory to cover the tuition on her master's program, because at the time it felt less like a sacrifice and more like a down payment on a life we were building together. You'll get it back tenfold. She told me the night I signed the paperwork at the bank, and I believed her completely the same way you believe a weather forecast when you want good weather badly enough. The loan officer at that bank, an older man named Grant, who'd financed half the small businesses in Collier Heights over 30 years, looked at me over his glasses and asked if I was certain about the terms twice, in the careful way a man asks when he already suspects the answer isn't really about the numbers. I told him I was certain. I wasn't not entirely, but certainty is a thing a 29-year-old man performs for a room, even when his stomach is telling him something different. We kept the cookout going every summer, after that the same Cascade Road tradition that first put us in the same backyard. 3 generations, arguing about potato salad while somebody's radio played gospel low enough to talk over. And for a long time, that cookout was the one place I still felt like myself, instead of like a line item in somebody else's business plan. The second thing to go was a franchise offer from a national plumbing supply company, a real one with my name already printed on the letterhead, which I turned down quietly the same month. Priscilla needed startup capital for a small environmental consulting outfit she was calling GreenFlow. I never told her about the franchise offer at all. I just let it go, the way you let go of a rope you've decided somebody else needs more than you do. My father passed the same year Micah was born quietly in his sleep in the same small house on Auburn Avenue where he'd raised me alone after my mother left when I was 9. He left me 2 things, a modest house with a leaking roof he never quite got around to fixing, and a set of hand tools with his initials burned carefully into each wooden handle, tools I still use to this day on jobs all over Collier Heights. The third thing to go was that house on Auburn Avenue, the only thing left of him besides those tools which I mortgaged a second time. So GreenFlow could make rent on its first real office space on Peachtree Street. I signed those papers alone at a different bank, Tuesday afternoon, Priscilla too deep in a fundraising call to come with me even though I'd asked twice. The loan officer that day was younger than Grant had been and didn't ask me twice whether I was certain, just slid the papers across and told me where to initial. I initialed every page without hesitating once and drove straight to the office space afterward to help carry in secondhand furniture Priscilla had found for half price, because that's what a man does when he's decided usefulness is the same thing as love. $81,000 borrowed against a dead man's house. And I never once said the number out loud to anyone, not even Priscilla. Micah was born in year 6 of the marriage, and for a while after that, the silence between Priscilla and me felt less like distance, and more like 2 people too tired at the end of the day to say much of anything, which is a different thing entirely and easy to mistake for the same problem if you're not paying close attention. I coached his youth league games on Saturday mornings, before opening shifts, packed his lunch myself most days, once Priscilla's schedule filled up with investor calls, and told myself that showing up quietly counted for just as much as saying anything out loud ever could. I won't stand here and tell you I was perfect through any of this, because I wasn't. There were years I let my silence curdle into something closer to resentment than patience years. I said, "I'm fine," through gritted teeth, instead of saying what I actually needed, and more than one anniversary dinner, where I sat quiet across the table, not out of strength, but out of something a lot more like cowardice. A man can spend 19 years fixing everybody's leaks and still let his own house flood on purpose, just a little, just enough to have something to be quietly angry about. I own that part of it too. A grudge is a poor tenant. You let it stay too long, it stops paying rent and starts tearing up the walls. I have spent 19 years fixing other people's leaks for a living. And somewhere along the way, I let my own house flood in complete silence. My hands tell that story better than my mouth ever could. Knuckles cracked no matter what lotion my sister buys me every Christmas. Calluses that used to catch on the sleeve of a dress shirt at every one of Priscilla's company dinners, snagging the fabric just enough that she'd reach over and smooth it without looking at me. Knees that pop climbing stairs now from 30 years spent kneeling under other people's sinks in other people's houses. A voicemail box on my old cell phone that filled up somewhere around year 12 and never got emptied again, mostly clients sometimes. Priscilla never once about anything that wasn't logistics. A work truck that started on the second try every single morning for 6 straight years. Not the first try, the second. And I never once had it looked at, because there never seemed to be a good week to be without it. They'd been useful. That's a very different thing from being valued. I want you to hold on to that question for the rest of this video, because by the end, I still wasn't sure which one I had been to her. It was around the 10th year of our marriage that I first noticed the porch light going off before I got home, even in winter, even when the house was warm and lit everywhere else. Priscilla said it was about the electric bill, one of 100 small habits left over from a childhood where the light sometimes got cut off entirely, and where a man in a repossession vest once stood in her family's driveway, while her mother begged him for one more week. There was one night around year 11 when I almost told her about the patent sitting quietly in that tin box. Almost slid the folder across the kitchen table between us, like a confession. She was on the phone with an investor when I walked in. With the folder still in my hand, mouthing an apology to me for the interruption, and I stood there a long moment before deciding the conversation could wait for a better night. That better night never quite arrived, the way better nights rarely do once a man gets comfortable waiting for one. I never argued with her about the light, because some fears don't shrink just because a person's bank account grows. I remember one particular evening, coming home late from a job on the west side, finding the porch dark and the house lit warm and gold behind the curtains, and standing in the driveway a full minute just looking at that gap between the two, the darkness outside and the light within, before I ever went in. It never once made me hate her. It just made sure I never mistook her caution for my own. That's not weakness on her part. That's just how a wound from childhood behaves when nobody ever names it out loud. By year 14, GreenFlow had grown from 3 employees crammed into a rented office to 111 employees and a glass building of its own in Buckhead. And Priscilla had grown into a woman the local business press liked to photograph standing in front of that building, always alone in the frame, always looking like she'd built it with nothing but her own 2 hands. I remember one specific dinner, GreenFlow's 5th anniversary gala, when Priscilla's mentor, a retired executive named Odette, looked me up and down in my one good suit and said loud enough for the table to hear, "You were never the brains of this operation. You were just the muscle that made sure the lights stayed on." Priscilla laughed along with the table, not cruelly. Exactly more the way you laugh at something true that you've stopped noticing is unkind. I laughed too because that's what 19 years of staying useful teaches a man to do. That night driving home from the gala, Priscilla apologized for Odette's comment without quite apologizing for her own laughter, saying only that Odette was old school and didn't mean anything by it. I told her it was fine, the way I told her almost everything was fine for the better part of 2 decades, and we didn't speak of it again for 11 more years. I was proud of her in a way that left no room over to be proud of myself. Patience isn't the same as doing nothing. And for a long time I told myself that every quiet year was patience, when really some of those years were just fear that had learned to dress itself up as virtue. 2 days before that October rainstorm, in a records room, 4 floors above a city council chamber on Peachtree Street, a soft-spoken attorney named Nia Calloway sat alone going line by line through the ownership history behind GreenFlow's biggest contract and stopped cold at a name she hadn't expected to see. 7 years earlier, Nia's mother ran a small overnight shelter for women out of a converted church annex in Sunnyside, and one January, the main supply line under the building split wide open at 2 in the morning, flooding the boiler room in freezing water. A plumber she'd never met before answered the emergency call at 2 in the morning a stranger's voice on the phone saying only, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Keep everybody upstairs and dry." He worked until sunrise in a boiler room, barely large enough to kneel in water, up past his ankles, the whole time splicing a section of pipe by flashlight, because the shelter couldn't afford to lose heat for even one more night, with 6 women and 2 infants sleeping upstairs. When Nia's mother tried to pay him at sunrise, he waved off the folded bills in her hand and said only that some jobs a man does, because his own grandmother once needed somebody to do the same for her a long time ago in a house nobody remembers the address of anymore. He left without taking a dime, and without leaving his last name, just a first name scrawled on a torn invoice pad. Marcus and a phone number Nia's mother lost within the year. Nia never learned that plumber's full name that night. She just remembered his hands and the quiet way he worked, and the fact that he never once mentioned what it cost him to skip a paying job to be there. "You didn't have to stay till sunrise," her mother told him that morning, and he'd only shrugged and said something about a grandmother of his own who once needed the same kindness from a stranger. Sitting alone in that records room 7 years later, staring at a patent filing 9 years old with the name Marcus Webb typed clean across the assignment line, something in Nia's chest went very still. She didn't call anyone that night. She just sat there a long moment, and then she picked up her phone and requested that the public comment period on the hearing be extended by 72 hours quietly, without explaining why a decision that would end up costing her far more than she understood in that moment. "My sister Colette has run the food pantry out of Cascade United AME for 11 years, sits on the usher board every second Sunday, and is the only person alive who can get me to do something I don't want to do, just by using my full government name. People in Collier Heights know Colette the way people know a lighthouse, not because she's loud about the work, but because the lights have stayed on that pantry every single Thursday for over a decade, rain or shine, holidays included. She never married, never had children of her own, and once told me the whole neighborhood was children enough for one lifetime. Marcus Devin Webb, you are going to that hearing," she told me over the phone the morning after the rain, in the exact voice she used on me as kids when I didn't want to go sit through Sunday school. I told her I had no interest in sitting in a city council chamber, watching my ex-wife's company get approved for a permit that had nothing left to do with me. Colette said the thing that actually moved me, that the water filtration system up for approval ran directly through Collier Heights, through pipes I had personally serviced for half the families still living on our block, including the Hendersons on the corner and old Miss Pearl 2 doors down from the church. I drove to Otis's hardware store that same afternoon, mostly to avoid sitting alone with the decision, and found him restocking a shelf of compression fittings identical to the ones still riding in my pocket. "You're going to go?" Otis said, not really a question before I'd said a word about it. I asked him how he already knew. "Because you've spent 19 years showing up for people who never once asked whether you had it in you," he said. "You're not going to stop now just because it's harder." I went for the neighborhood. I told myself that for 3 straight days, the same 3 days. Otis kept asking me why I hadn't opened the tin box under my workbench yet. Those same 3 days, I kept working because a man doesn't stop fixing pipes just because his marriage ended. I replaced a corroded shutoff valve for Miss Pearl on Wednesday, the same valve I'd first installed for her back when Micah was still in diapers, and she pressed $2 into my hand for gas money the way she has every single visit for 11 years, no matter how many times I tell her it isn't necessary. I knelt on her cold kitchen floor, the way I've knelt on 1,000 cold kitchen floors, and my knees told me the same thing they always tell me now, which is that 30 years of this work leaves a mark whether or not anybody ever sees it. "You look tired, baby," Miss Pearl said. And I told her I was fine, the way I've told everybody I was fine for the better part of 2 decades. I stopped by the Hendersons' place after that. A young couple with 2 kids who'd bought their first house the year before, and spent 40 minutes explaining to their oldest boy how a shutoff valve worked, while his mother made me take a plate of food home, even though I told her 3 times it wasn't necessary. Their son asked me question after question the whole 40 minutes, the kind of endless, curious questions a 7-year-old asks when he's decided a grown man's work is the most fascinating thing in the world. and something about his attention loosened a knot in my chest I hadn't realized was still there since the rain the night before. Their porch light was on when I left, bright and steady against the gray afternoon, and I remember thinking, without quite knowing why, how much I envied a house that kept its lights on without calculating the cost first. I sat in my truck outside their house a moment longer than I needed to, before driving off, watching that steady porch light through the windshield, letting it remind me of something I couldn't yet name. What I didn't know yet was sitting in a folder 3 floors above, the very chamber where I'd be sitting, and it wasn't going to stay in that folder much longer. 2 days earlier, Nia Calloway had pulled the full chain of title on GreenFlow's patent license and found an 18-month gap where the rights had passed silently through a shell entity that never actually held clean ownership, because the original inventor of record had never formally transferred the patent to anyone at all. That inventor of record was a plumbing contractor named Marcus Webb. Filed 9 years earlier for a residential filtration valve system he had built alone in his own garage during a slow winter when contract work was scarce and money was tighter than he ever let on. I remember that winter clearly, the way you remember any season that turns out to matter more than you expected it to at the time. Contracts had dried up citywide. GreenFlow was 2 years old and still bleeding cash, and I spent 3 months in that cold garage, tinkering with a valve design meant to solve a problem I saw in half the aging houses in Collier Heights, where old filtration systems clogged fast and cost families money they didn't have to spare. I filed the patent quietly, using savings. Priscilla didn't know I still had, mostly because I liked having one thing in the world that was fully mine, built entirely with my own 2 hands, answerable to nobody's board meeting. I never told her about it, not because I was hiding something shameful, but because for the first time in years, I had something that didn't need her permission to exist. I remember sitting across from a young patent attorney downtown, a woman who kept asking if I was sure I wanted to file under my own name instead of forming a company first the way most inventors did, for tax reasons. "My name's the only company I've ever needed," I told her, and she smiled like she'd heard that line before, but still appreciated hearing it again. I paid the filing fee in cash, saved up over 4 months from side jobs. Priscilla never knew about, and walked out of that office, feeling lighter than I had in years. 9 years later, GreenFlow bought the rights to a filtration technology through 3 layers of paperwork, and never once traced it back to a garage 2 miles from their glass building in Buckhead. Nia didn't say a word to her supervisor yet. She just sat with what she'd found, the way you sit with a diagnosis before you're ready to say it out loud to the person it belongs to. I want you to notice 3 small things about me while I tell you this next part, because all 3 of them matter later. I still carried a small brass compression fitting in my front pocket, the one my grandfather Cornelius handed me the day I passed my journeyman exam. Worn smooth now from 30 years of my thumb running over it whenever a room got too quiet for comfort. I still wore my wedding ring even after signing the separation papers, because taking it off felt like a job I hadn't finished yet. And I still hadn't opened the tin box under my workbench, even though I'd known exactly what was sealed inside it for 9 straight years. Pressure doesn't ruin a good system. It only proves what was built to code and what was never built to hold in the first place. That was one of Cornelius's sayings, and it took me most of my adult life to understand. He wasn't only ever talking about pipes. The night before the hearing, my old Army buddy Otis, who owns the hardware store 2 blocks off Cascade Road, sat with me in my cold garage while I finally lifted the lid off that tin box for the first time in 9 years. Inside was the original notarized patent assignment, still crisp, folded in thirds, the way I'd left it. Underneath that was a fading photograph of me at 22, standing beside my grandfather in front of his first plumbing van, both of us squinting into the sun. And underneath the photograph was a letter in Cornelius's handwriting that I had never once read out loud to anyone, not even myself, not all the way through. Otis didn't say much. He just poured 2 cups of coffee and let me sit with it a while, the way a good friend does when he already knows there's nothing useful he could add. I unfolded Cornelius's letter, partway enough to see the first line in his shaky handwriting. And then I folded it right back up because I wasn't ready yet for whatever came after that first line. Otis noticed and didn't push. "Some things a man reads when he's ready," he said. "Not when it's convenient." Otis and I met at Fort Benning 25 years ago, two 19-year-olds from different sides of the state who ended up bunking near each other for reasons neither of us ever fully understood, and he's been the closest thing I've had to a brother ever since my own father passed. He opened the hardware store on Cascade Road 12 years ago. With a small business loan and a lot of stubbornness, and he's the only person besides Colette who's had a standing key to my garage the entire time I've lived on that street. Some folks mistake quiet for broken. They're never the same thing. Recognition cluster for anybody who's lived a version of this. The smell of pipe dope that never fully leaves a man's hands, no matter how many times he washes them. A lunch pail she used to pack every morning for the first 9 years. Then quietly stopped packing without either of us ever discussing it. A wedding ring worn a full size too loose, now turning easily around a finger thinner than it used to be from work he never stopped doing, even when the marriage stopped feeling like a marriage. Steel-toed boots polished every Sunday night for church the next morning, worn thin at the exact same spot. Every pair wears thin, no matter how many pairs a man goes through in 30 years. A sandwich eaten standing up at the kitchen counter at 11 o'clock at night because some habits outlive whatever hurt first put them there. The morning of the hearing, Colette showed up at my door before 7 with a folder of her own, thick enough that it made a sound when she set it down on my kitchen table. "You need to see this before you walk into that room," she said. And her voice had none of the Sunday school firmness from the day before, only something closer to worry. She'd gone by the family court records office the previous afternoon, a favor from a friend named Ruthie, who worked the front desk and had known Colette since Vacation Bible School 30 years earlier. Ruthie slid the file across the counter without a word, glancing once toward the hallway to make sure no one was watching, and told Colette only that she had 15 minutes before her supervisor came back from lunch. Colette photographed every page on her phone, standing in a stairwell, hands shaking slightly because she already suspected, before she finished reading, that whatever was in that folder was going to change how her brother walked into that hearing the next morning. She found paperwork. Priscilla's business partner, a man named Trevor Cole, had quietly filed weeks earlier, trying to limit my custody time with our son Micah, 4 inches thick, citing work dates and job details that didn't match a single actual shift I'd worked all year. I hadn't guessed that part. I don't think anybody watching this guessed that part either. "Why would Trevor file anything against you at all?" I asked her, "when he's not even family." Colette didn't have a full answer for that yet, only a guess, and her guess turned out to be closer to the truth than either of us wanted it to be. That night, unable to sleep, I sat with Colette on her porch until almost midnight, both of us wrapped in old quilts against the cold, and I finally admitted out loud that I was afraid of what walking into that hearing might actually cost me. "What's it cost you to stay quiet instead?" she asked, and I didn't have a good answer for that either, not one I was proud of. 19 years, I said finally, and she just nodded because she already knew the number better than I'd wanted to say it. Something about the custody filing had bothered me since Colette first mentioned it, a detail I couldn't quite place until nearly midnight, sitting on that cold porch. The dates Trevor had cited didn't just fail to match my schedule. They matched almost exactly the weeks Priscilla and I had been discussing mediation. Privately weeks nobody outside our 2 lawyers should have known about. I didn't say that thought out loud to Colette that night. I just sat with it, turning my grandfather's brass fitting over and over in my pocket, the way I always did when a shape was starting to form that I wasn't ready to name yet. Her cruelty in that moment was never really about me, if I'm honest, and it took me a long while to understand that fully it was insurance against a fear she'd been carrying since she was 11 years old, watching a repossession truck pull out of her family's driveway. The fear that anything good could be taken from her the instant she stopped being useful enough to keep. She told me the whole story only once, early in our marriage on a night. She'd had 1 glass in, too many to keep her guard fully in up her father's hardware supply business, failing quietly over 18 months. The calls from creditors, her mother answered in a whisper, so the neighbors wouldn't hear, and the morning a man in a gray uniform stood in their driveway with a clipboard, while her mother begged him unsuccessfully for one more week. Priscilla was 11 years old, standing at the window in her school uniform, watching her mother's dignity get itemized on a form. The man with the clipboard wasn't cruel about it, she told me, which somehow made it worse. Businesslike and polite the entire time, checking boxes while a family's whole life waited in cardboard boxes on the lawn. She never told that story again after that night. Not to me. Not to anyone I ever heard of, and I understood even then that some wounds only get spoken once before they go back underground for good. Trevor's fear was simpler and far less forgivable. A man who measured his own worth entirely by what he could attach his name to, terrified of being the only person in the room without a title on the door. What none of us knew yet was that Nia had already paid a price for the 72-hour extension she'd requested quietly, days before any of us walked into that building. The council chair, an old friend of Priscilla's from law school, had called Nia into his office the previous afternoon and asked her, not unkindly, but not gently either, whether she understood what kind of career a young attorney could lose by delaying a contract this size over what he called a paperwork technicality. With respect, son, Nia told him, an unresolved chain of title isn't a technicality. It's the entire question this board exists to answer. He reminded her more pointedly this time that GreenFlow's leadership had friends on the board who wouldn't forget how this went. Then I hope they remember it went by the book, she said, and left his office before he could respond. Nia told him she understood exactly what she stood to lose and filed the extension anyway. That's the second envelope in this story. The one that mattered more than any of us realized at the time, and I didn't understand what I was looking at until 11 days later, when I finally sat down with her over coffee and heard the whole thing from her side. Somewhere near the entrance of the hearing chamber that morning, I heard the low murmur of a door opening, footsteps on marble, and Priscilla's voice, calm and practiced, already rehearsing her opening remarks to a junior associate half a step behind her. She didn't see me yet, standing near the back with Otis and Colette. And for one strange second, I watched her, the way you watch somebody you used to know, completely noticing the small things, the new watch on her wrist, the slight tension in her shoulders that even good posture couldn't fully hide, the way she still touched her left earring twice before any important meeting, a habit from 19 years ago that apparently never left her. The hearing room on Peachtree Street holds exactly 11 members of the public when it's completely full. And that morning, it was completely full. Priscilla stood at the podium in a charcoal suit, calm, articulate, exactly the woman the business press loved to photograph, walking the council through GreenFlow's filtration contract like she'd rehearsed every line of it in her sleep the night before. 2 photographers from the local paper stood near the side wall. Cameras already up, and a GreenFlow junior associate leaned toward Priscilla and whispered something that made her smile without breaking her rhythm at the podium. I sat in the third row with Otis on one side of me and Colette on the other, my grandfather's brass fitting warm and turning slowly in my closed right fist. Somewhere behind me, a man in a gray suit murmured to his neighbor that plumbers make decent money these days, didn't they? And his neighbor laughed just loud enough for the third row to hear it. Still nothing from me, still calm, still holding that brass fitting like it was the only steady thing left in the room. Nia Calloway stood the moment. The council chair opened the floor for procedural concerns, and her voice didn't shake once. She stated plainly that the chain of title behind the patent underlying GreenFlow's contract had an unresolved gap, and that the original inventor of record needed to be formally accounted for before any license could move forward. What most of the room didn't know was that Nia's own father had been an electrician for 31 years before a workplace injury ended his career early, and that she'd grown up watching a man just as skilled and just as overlooked as I was, which was part of why my name on that filing had stopped her cold in the first place. Somebody 2 rows behind me whispered the contract's total value out loud before the council even got to it. $341 million, sitting now entirely in question. Priscilla's expression didn't change, not at first, not even a little. Then the council chair asked Nia to state the inventor's name for the official record. Marcus Webb, she said. The room turned. For a moment, nobody moved at all, the way a room goes still, right before a verdict, and I could hear the faint hum of the ceiling lights overhead. The shuffle of someone's notebook, the distant sound of traffic outside on Peachtree Street. A counsel aide, near the back, leaned toward her colleague and whispered something I couldn't hear, and the colleague's eyebrows went up in the universal expression of somebody realizing a routine. Tuesday had just become something else entirely. I felt every eye in that chamber land on me at once, cameras included, and for one long second I felt something closer to shame than to pride, because I had known for 9 years and never once said a word to anyone about what I was sitting on. It wasn't the good kind of attention, the kind a man dreams about when he imagines finally being seen. It was the kind that makes a person want to disappear into the nearest wall. Because being seen after 9 years of choosing not to be is its own particular kind of exposure, and no amount of vindication makes that first second comfortable. Trevor Cole stood up fast, already reaching for his phone, already distancing himself from a decade of partnership, in a single sentence telling the nearest reporter he'd had no visibility into that agreement. The same reporter he'd been quietly courting for a favorable story for months. One of the council members, a woman named Charlene, who'd approved dozens of GreenFlow's earlier permits. Without a second look, set down her pen and asked Priscilla directly whether GreenFlow's leadership had known about the ownership gap before this morning. Priscilla hesitated just long enough for the whole room to notice the hesitation, before saying that the shell entity's paperwork had been vetted by outside counsel years earlier. "That wasn't the question," Charlene said, and let the silence that followed do the rest of the work for her. "That sounds like a you problem," someone behind me muttered, and I recognized the voice as Deborah, a woman who used to bring casseroles by our house before the divorce and hadn't said one word to Priscilla since. Priscilla turned in her seat and looked straight at me, and what she said next landed harder than anything else in that entire hearing. "You never once fought for yourself in 19 years. She said quiet enough that only the front 2 rows caught it. "Don't stand there now and let anybody in this room think you did any of it for me." I didn't answer that with anger. I answered it with the plain truth, which is that I had known about the patent for 9 years and chosen every single one of those years not to use it against her, because some part of me still believed that protecting her silently was the same thing as loving her. Micah's custody filing was the only thing that ever changed my mind about that. Trevor, still standing, tried once more to distance himself, saying loudly that he'd simply been protecting the company's interests, and this time nobody in the room bothered to respond to him at all, which was its own kind of verdict. 2 seats over, an older board member, I recognized from the newspaper photos, simply closed her folder and set her pen down, flat on top of it. A gesture I'd come to understand later meant she'd already made up her mind about something far bigger than the patent question in front of them. A junior board member, 2 seats down from where Priscilla had been sitting quietly, gathered his folder and moved 1 seat further away from Trevor. A small gesture that said more than any statement could have. Somewhere in the back room, a woman I didn't recognize was already typing notes into her phone, and I found out later she worked for a non-profit that tracked municipal contracts for exactly this kind of irregularity. The sort of quiet accountability nobody thinks about until the day it matters. For one long moment, nobody in that room said anything at all. And in that silence, I felt something close to respect for her. Even then, even standing in the wreckage of what she'd just said to me in front of 11 strangers, she wasn't wrong, and both of us knew it. I said 1 sentence to the entire room, the shortest sentence I said all day. "I'm a plumber. I fix what's broken before it floods the whole house." Then I picked up my grandfather's tool bag from beside my chair and walked out past 11 strangers, past a woman I had loved for 19 years, past a room that had finally seen the full shape of what I'd been quietly carrying. And I did not say one unkind word on my way to the door. By the next morning, the story had made 3 local news outlets, always with the same photograph of me from the hearing tool bag in hand. Expression unreadable, and always with some version of the headline, calling it an unlikely twist in a routine licensing dispute. I didn't give a single interview. Otis fielded 2 calls from reporters at the hardware store and told both of them the same thing, that I wasn't interested in being anybody's headline, only in getting back to work. Miss Pearl called Colette to say she'd always known there was something different about the man who fixed her pipes. And Colette laughed for the first time in days, telling me about it. I found out later secondhand through Colette that Priscilla sat alone in her glass office in Buckhead for almost 2 hours after the hearing ended. Blinds drawn, phone turned off, the same office where the business press used to photograph her standing so confidently in the window. An assistant said she found her that evening still in her charcoal suit, staring at nothing in particular. And that when the assistant asked if she needed anything, Priscilla only asked to be left alone a little longer. I don't know exactly what she was thinking in that office, and I've stopped needing to know. Atlanta at night looks the same, whether your life just changed or it didn't, and I drove home along Cascade Road, with the windows cracked, letting the cold air do what silence has always done for me better than words could. A text came through a little after 9 o'clock. I'm sorry it said nothing else attached to it. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and let the porch lights of Collier Heights pass by one after another, all of them lit, none of them dimmed, to save on a bill nobody in those houses could afford to worry about that particular night. The brass fitting was still in my pocket by the time I reached Colette's house, worn smoother now than it had been that morning. She had the kettle already going before I even knocked, because that's what my sister does, instead of asking whether you're all right. 2 mugs sat on the table, one for me and one that used to belong to our mother, kept in the same cabinet since the year she passed, still brought down on nights that call for it. Every system fails the same way twice before somebody finally checks the source. I told Colette, and she just nodded, because she'd heard our grandfather say some version of that 100 times, growing up in that same kitchen. You did the right thing going, she said, refilling my mug, even though it was still half full. Not the easy thing, the right thing. I know, I told her, but I keep waiting to feel like it. That's not how it works, she said. The feeling comes later, usually when you least expect it, usually over something small. She was right, though it would take me another 2 days to understand exactly what she meant by that. Colette's phone rang while the kettle was still going, and she stepped into the hallway to take it, coming back a few minutes later with an odd look on her face. That was Priscilla, she said. She wanted to know if you were all right. I asked what Colette told her. I told her the truth, Colette said. That you walked out of that room without saying one cruel thing to anybody, and that most people in her position couldn't say the same about themselves. Priscilla hadn't asked to speak to me directly, and I didn't ask Colette to arrange it. Some doors close best when nobody forces them back open before they're ready. We sat there a long while without saying much else, and that turned out to be the first night in longer than I could remember, where the silence in a room with me in it didn't feel like something I owed an explanation for, but there was still one conversation left to have. The one that would finally let my son understand why his father never once raised his voice through any of this. Not even the night the porch light went out for the last time. Micah showed up at Colette's the next morning before I was even fully out of bed. 16 years old and still wearing his mother's stubborn jaw, standing in the kitchen doorway with a question he'd clearly been carrying since the hearing ended. Dad, if you knew about the patent for 9 years, he said, why didn't you ever use it? I poured coffee before I answered him. Because some questions deserve a full cup first. A man's worth isn't in what people say about him at a party, I told him. It's in what he builds when nobody's watching him build it. I didn't fully understand that yet, and I didn't expect him to not at 16 years old, not yet. I told him about the franchise offer. I never mentioned to his mother about the second mortgage on his great-grandfather's house. About $81,000 I'd never once said out loud to anyone in 19 years, and I watched something shift behind his eyes as the numbers landed. 2 days after that conversation with Micah, the feeling Colette promised finally arrived, and it came exactly as she'd predicted over something small. I was replacing a washer in an old kitchen faucet for a widow named Hattie on the next street over. A $5 part and 20 minutes of work, and she thanked me the way she always did, calling me a blessing, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the word didn't feel like it was describing somebody else. "That's not about being right, Micah," I said. "That's about a man who forgot he was allowed to matter too." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his own coffee mug in a slow circle, the way I turned my grandfather's fitting, and I realized, watching him, that habits travel down a family whether or not anyone ever teaches them on purpose. "Are you and Mom going to hate each other now?" he asked. And it was the most honest question anybody had asked me in 19 years. "No," I told him. "Your mother and I are going to be two people who built something real together and then found out we'd been building it out of different materials the whole time." He nodded slowly, the way a 16-year-old nods when he's decided an answer is good enough for today, even if he'll have more questions later. 3 days after that conversation, Micah asked if he could come by the workshop on Cascade Road, something he hadn't done regularly since he was maybe 10 years old, and stood watching me rebuild a customer's water heater for the better part of an hour without saying much of anything. "You're pretty good at this," he said finally, like it was a discovery rather than a fact he'd known his whole life. "Your great-grandfather was better," I told him, nodding toward the tools, with his initials still burned into the handles. "Some things a family passes down, whether or not anybody ever sits you down to teach them on purpose," and watching Micah's hands move over that water heater. Careful and unhurried, I recognized my grandfather's patience showing up 2 generations later without anybody ever having to name it out loud. I pulled on my grandfather's old work jacket that morning, the one with a small burn mark near the left cuff from a torch. He never let anybody else use, still hanging on a hook in Colette's mudroom 15 years after he passed. It didn't fit quite right anymore, tighter across the shoulders than I remembered, the way a man's own past always fits a little differently once he's grown into the rest of his life. I poured a second cup of coffee. I didn't finish and let it go cold on the porch railing beside me, the way I used to leave things cold and half-finished for 19 years without ever quite noticing I was doing it. That afternoon, I sat alone on Colette's front porch with the same brass fitting turning slowly between my fingers, and I finally let myself say the thing out loud that I hadn't said to anyone yet. Not Otis, not Colette, not even to Cornelius's letter still folded in that tin box. What I hadn't forgiven wasn't her leaving. It was the boy in me who used to believe love was something you had to earn by being useful. A closed valve isn't broken. Sometimes it's only protecting what's downstream, and for 19 years I told myself my silence was protecting Priscilla, when really it had started out protecting me from ever finding out whether I was lovable without also being needed. That evening, I finally read Cornelius's letter the whole way through out loud, alone in my workshop with the tin box open on the bench in front of me. He'd written it the year before he passed, addressed simply to whoever needed it someday. And near the top he'd written about the winter he built that workbench, how his own hands shook the whole time from a cold he never told anybody about because he didn't want to be a burden during the holidays. Further down, he wrote about my grandmother and about 40 years of ushering people into a church he wasn't always sure he still believed in himself, and about how love and duty can look identical from the outside and still be 2 completely different things on the inside. And near the bottom, in handwriting, shakier than I remembered his hands ever being, he'd written that a man's silence is worth something, only if he chose it, and worth nothing at all if it was only ever fear wearing his good clothes. He signed it the way he signed everything, with just his first initial and the date, and beneath that, one final line I read 3 times before I could fully take it in: "Whatever you're holding on to, boy, put it down before it starts holding on to you instead." Anger doesn't cancel out love. It just means the love hasn't finished healing yet. 11 days after the hearing, I finally sat down with Nia Calloway at a small coffee shop on Auburn Avenue. Both of us, a little unsure how to start a conversation that had been building for 7 years without either of us knowing it. She told me about the shelter, about her mother, about a plumber who never gave his last name and left before sunrise without taking a dime. I told her I remembered that January too. Remembered the cold in that boiler room, remembered thinking at the time that some jobs a man just does because somebody once did the same for his own grandmother. I almost didn't request that extension, she admitted, turning her cup slowly on the table. My chair made it very clear what it might cost me. I asked her why she filed it anyway. Because some things a person recognizes even when they can't fully explain how my son, she said, and I recognized your name before I ever understood why. Cornelius used to say water always finds the truth in a house. It took 9 years, 1 tin box, and 1 rain-soaked October night. But it finally found mine. I'm not here to tell you. Priscilla was a villain because she wasn't, not underneath it. A woman who watched a repossession truck pull out of her family's driveway at 11 years old learns to hold on to control the same way some of us learn to hold on to silence. And both of those things start out as survival, long before they ever start costing you the people you love. I forgave her for leaving a long time, before I forgave myself for staying quiet as long as I did. And if you take just one thing from this story, let it be that those are 2 very different acts of forgiveness, and you are allowed to move through them at 2 very different speeds. Trevor lost his position at GreenFlow within the month, not because of the custody filing directly, but because a board that watches a man abandon his partner on camera starts wondering quietly what else he'd abandon under pressure. Nia kept her job, though it took the intervention of 2 board members who remembered exactly what kind of integrity her 72-hour extension had actually protected. And Priscilla, the last I heard from Colette, still runs GreenFlow now, with a properly licensed patent and a name on the filing that isn't hers. A fact she has to sit with every single time that contract comes up in a meeting. The council eventually approved the license once GreenFlow negotiated a formal royalty agreement with me directly. A fair one handled entirely through Nia's office rather than any conversation between Priscilla and me. And the water in Collier Heights runs cleaner now, because of an argument that started on a rainy porch and ended in a hearing room 3 miles away. None of that felt like winning to me. It just felt like water finally settling where it was always supposed to be. I still see Priscilla sometimes at school events for Micah, at the occasional community function. Neither of us can politely avoid, and we are civil in the particular way. 2 people are civil when they've decided the war is over, even if the peace treaty was never formally signed. Some chapters don't need a dramatic close. They just need you to stop turning back to reread them. Dignity at our age isn't a speech. It's showing up on an ordinary Tuesday and doing the work anyway, whether or not anybody in the room ever finds out your name. Most of us take 20 years to understand the things our grandparents said in about 10 seconds. And I was no exception, standing in that hearing room at 47 years old, finally catching up to a sentence Cornelius handed me when I was 22. If there's a version of this story happening in your own house right now, I hope you find your version of that tin box before it takes you 9 years. And I hope whatever it holds, you find the courage to open it on your own timeline instead of somebody else's.